Welcome back, folks. We got a little interesting gun here on the bench today, something we picked up at the range just this past week. This is the Remington XP100 bolt-action pistol. And this is a 1980 manufactured gun, chambered for 7mm bench rest or 7mm BR Remington. We'll talk about that chambering here in just a little bit, but a little of the history of the design of this gun, and then we'll get into this particular piece. And we've talked a bit in the past about some of the absolute rock star engineers that Remington had working for him in the post-war years after World War II. During the war, of course, Remington, Winchester, Savage, Marlin, everybody really were concentrated on war effort and war materials. But after the war was over, Remington really wanted to get a handle on the commercial sporting market. It was guns for sportsmen and hunters. And Winchester had kind of owned that market, especially with their Model 94 lever action, Model 70 bolt action, and the Model 12 pump action shotgun. So Remington had some engineers in their stable that were going to introduce some models that completely changed that game a lot. We've talked about the Remington 700 already. And in the 50s, they had the 720 series of rifles that Mike Walker had been instrumental in designing. But they had another engineer, another designer by the name of Wayne Leek, L-E-E-K, Wayne Leek. And he was an extremely prolific designer for Remington. You can thank him for the Nylon 66 rifle. You can thank him for the Remington 870. Some 11 million units of those have been produced and sold since then and still in production today. The Remington 1100, those are all Wayne Leek. So in the 50s, he approached the powers that be at Remington and said, hey, people are wanting to start hunting with handguns, so let's do a bolt-action handgun. We've got this 40X action here, and we can build a handgun around it. And Remington said, no, not really. We need to really concentrate on winning this shotgun war. And so the 870 and the 740 and the 742, 760 rifles, they were all coming out and really starting to take the place by storm. But by the early 60s, they said, okay, we can do this now. So they got their heads together and they designed what became the Remington Experimental Pistol 100 or XP100, and that was this pistol here, or the earlier version of this pistol here. So Remington was owned by the DuPont company at that time, and DuPont, among other things, made synthetic materials, nylon materials specifically. And they had a particular blend called Zytel, and Wayne Leek had used that material to make the stocks for the Nylon 66 back in the late 50s. And so he continued along, and you can tell if you're familiar with the Nylon 66 rifle, the Mohawk Brown Nylon 66 has this same brown dyed finish to the Zytel stock, same white diamonds, inlaid, white line spacers, very similar in design to the Nylon 66. So it's kind of a carryover. The original XP100 had a 10.5-inch barrel that came out to just about right here, and with a black ventilated rib, the Nylon 66 style front sight, and an adjustable rear sight drilled and tapped for a scope. And they'd originally chambered this gun in .222 Remington, which was the bench rest target cartridge of the day. If you were a bench rest shooter, you shot .222. But what they discovered was they were losing so much velocity, so much muzzle blast, so much fire out of the end of it. It was just too much case capacity for the amount of barrel that they had. They were losing too much powder out of the 10.5-inch barrel. So they shortened the case down to 1.3 inches and created a new round. And it was much more efficient than the .222. But still retained about 90% of the velocity and was still an accurate round, and they called it the .221 Remington. And because there was still a bit of a fireball on the end of it, they just kind of jokingly said, okay, well, it's the .221 Fireball, and that's what the round was called. And in fact, it became so synonymous with this pistol that a lot of people, instead of calling this pistol the XP100, they called it the Remington Fireball. Anyway, that was in 1963 when this was introduced. Great year, 1963. I was introduced in 1963 for that matter, so it had to be a hell of a year. And it stayed, that configuration, that 10.5-inch vent rib .221 Fireball, stayed in line until 1985. The gun itself stayed in line until 1994 in various fashions. And I've got some notes here because there's a ton of different calibers, ton of different variations that this gun was introduced in. So the 221 Fireball was rocking along until right at 1980, 1979. And as soon as the gun was introduced, gunsmiths and wildcatters were doing, I mean, it's a bolt action, basically, it's a rifle action with a recoil lug, and it's very much Remington 700-ish or Remington 600-ish, if you will. So rechambering and making barrels and putting barrels on this gun is not that difficult a process. So they were doing anything that would fit in this single shot action, they were putting barrels on it. So Remington decided they would come up with something to give a little bit more energy for the handgun hunter and for the sport of metallic silhouette shooting, where you would engage a metal ram target at 200 meters and you had to knock it over. So they took the .308 Winchester case, shortened it, necked it to 7mm, and it became the 7mm bench rest Remington, or 7mm BR, and that's what this is chambered in. So for that cartridge introduced in 1980, this version of the XP100 introduced in 1980 called the XP100 Silhouette, which is this particular submodel. They increased this barrel length from 10.5 to 14.5 inches, kept the Zytel stock, and put it in that 7mm bench rest. And so people say, hey, that's pretty cool, so let's neck that down, and made it a 6mm bench rest, and it just kept going from there. So some other variants in 1986, or 1985 is when it started, but it introduced in 86, a magazine writer named Milek, M-I-L-E-K, Bob Milek, big handgun shooter, big handgun hunter, talked Remington into chambering this gun in the 223, and it became the Varmint Special 14.5-inch heavier barrel in 223. And then they had the XP100 Hunter, the XP100 Custom, just various calibers. They ended up making this gun, this Silhouette gun, in 35 Remington for even more energy. So just a quick rundown of the calibers this gun was available in, and then we'll talk about some intricacies of the particular pistol. So the standard calibers available from Remington is 221 Fireball, 223 in the Varmint Special, 7mm BR in the Silhouette, but they also did 708 in the XP100 Hunter, the 7mm 08, and the 35 Remington as well, beginning about 1994. So in 1992, all this going on in the early 90s, the Remington Custom Shop really dialed in on this model, and they started making it in 22 250, 250 Savage, 260 Remington, the 6BR 308, even 350 Remington Magnum. Now that ought to be a bit of a chunk to shoot in 350 Remington Mag, but that said, gunsmiths and hunters were doing all kind of other stuff with this gun too. I read a story where a guy had one built in 325 Winchester short mag, and he was shooting stuff with it on other continents. And I mean, that should be a sight to see, this gun in 325 short mag. So this is a single shot bolt action gun. We'll make sure it's clear. And we have the grip here kind of in the middle, and that's simply to allow it to balance. Now, the typical shooting style of the time, particularly for the metallic silhouette game, was a person would lay down, kind of recline down, and then have this pistol on the outside of the leg bent at the pistol outside the leg. It's called a Creedmoor shooting position. And this gun is kind of designed to fit that position. Now, there's been a lot of criticism for this gun for a right-handed shooter because the bolt's on the right side. So in other words, to run the bolt, you either have to break your shooting grip or you have to reach over with the left hand, and with a scope on it, that can be hard to do. So people have criticized that Remington should have put the bolt on the left side. I mean, you can argue that. Savage did it with their bolt action pistol. You can make it work both ways. But in any event, it's on the right side. You have a typical sliding safety here, but it's not a 700 trigger. Obviously, the sear housing is back here, and the trigger unit's back here, so there's a trigger link that runs the gamut here. So unlike most other actions that have a trigger linkage like that, this trigger is actually fairly nice. They are kind of creepy. They have a little bit of movement before the Silhouette scope, but it's manageable. And before I came here today, I put it on my electronic scale at the shop, and this trigger trips at 2 pounds 1 ounce on average, which is incredibly light for something that has a trigger bar in it. But it does have a little bit of roll, a little bit of creep in it. So that's something that there's some adjustment there, and we're going to take it out of the stock here in just a few minutes, and we'll look at how that possibly can be done. But again, we have just this single shot pistol. They did make a repeater in the 90s. They made a 3-shot repeater, and to do that, they moved the grip to the rear. And by this time, this was a walnut stock and not the Zytel nylon, but they moved the grip to the rear for the repeater. It had a 3-round box magazine in there in various calibers as well. There was a rimfire version, 22 rimfire version in the repeater with a detachable box magazine. Very, very few of those were made. Gosh, probably less than 1,000, if that many. I'm not sure of those numbers though. And of course, there have been many gunsmiths that convert this from the mid grip to the rear grip, and you have to drill and trap another hole here for a trigger and put a Remington Model 7 trigger in there. But these are interesting little guns. They are unlike the rest of the Remington bolt action lineage as far as how these guns operate. So there's no bolt release here. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense for bolt release here when the bolt locks up here. So getting the bolt out of one of these to clean the gun from the chamber end is a little tricky. So I don't know how close up we can get on it, but this is any kind of little tool will work. I think this is a Smith & Wesson pistol backstrap tool, to be honest with you, but any kind of slender tool will work. But what we're going to do is we're going to go in right along the bolt here, and we're going to depress the bolt lock lever. If I can do this from this angle, we'll see. Whoop. And once you depress that bolt lock lever, you can remove the bolt. And when we take it out of the stock here in a minute, you'll see exactly what I've pressed and what I'm talking about. But let's take just a quick look at the bolt. The bolt has this characteristic dog leg shape that you see in the Remington 600, also Remington 600, 660, and the XP100. And this actually was not a new design for Remington. You can go back to the 1920s and look at the Remington 30 Express, which was a derivative of the 1917 Enfield, and see that same kind of dog leg. So one thing, and we'll talk about some things you want to look for on these guns too. Here we have the last 4 digits of a serial number. You want to make sure that that is matching the serial number on the receiver. In this case, it does. Now, the bolt face is the same as any other Remington rifle bolt. So you still have the plunger type ejector there, and over here you have that C-clip style spring steel extractor that's underneath the lip of this bolt face. So you always want to check that on any Remington product to make sure that it's still present, to make sure that you don't have any cracks. This is the rivet, this hole right here, if you can see that. This is the rivet for that extractor. And you want to make sure that we're not cracked here. I've not really seen that on XP100s because the XP100 crowd typically took care of their rifles more than, say, the Remington 742 or 760 crowd. So that's typically not a problem on this gun. This hole right here is a cross pin for the ejector. If you wanted to pull the ejector, you push out that cross pin, the ejector comes out the front with a spring underneath it. So that said, this is nothing different than most other Remington bolt action rifles as far as the bolt goes. So the scope mounting on this gun, it's drilled and tapped on the top. We have 3 holes, not 4. We just don't have enough room on this receiver bridge here. But the scope mounts are still made. You can still get scope bases for this gun. It shares a scope base with the Remington 600 series and the early Remington Model 7. The early Remington Model 7 is also a 3-hole gun. It's the same scope base. So most people at the time when we got this scope, it had a Redfield 1-piece base and rings with a Leupold M8 2-power pistol scope on it. And the pistol scope, this is a 1980 gun, and the Leupold scope that was on it was a 1981 M prefix serial number. 1981 scope. So it's probably been on the gun since it was new. Not the best scope. Now this is strictly an opinion. Not the best scope for a pistol and 7 bench rest, which is fully a 200-yard pistol. So we may put an EGW scope base on there. Our friends at Evolution Gun Works make a Picatinny style base for this gun, and that will allow us to put an intermediate eye relief type scope on there with variable magnification, which will take advantage of the capabilities of this rifle. So when we were working on these things back in the 80s and 90s, we would get phone calls quite a bit of people wanting to take the gun out of the action, or the action out of the stock, and people wanting to adjust the trigger to try to take care of some of that creep. The triggers are adjustable, but again, this is one of those situations like the Remington 700 where they're going to come from the factory adjusted, and they're going to come with a thread locker or lacquer on the screws. And from a commercial standpoint, as a gun shop or as a working gunsmith, we probably wouldn't want to do that because you never know what the end result is going to be or what's going to be done to the gun after you send it out. And as soon as you defeat that lacquer, then you own it. Now, if you're the end user of this gun and you want to adjust your own trigger, by all means do that. I've not heard of an XP100 having the problems that, say, the Remington 700 Walker trigger guns had. But it is possible to adjust them out of spec to where they will drop the striker on bolt close. So we're going to cut for just a second, and I'm going to pull this gun out of the, well, let me show you what I'm going to do first. To pull the gun out of the stock, there are 2 bolts. This one right here, which is pretty obvious, this bolt right here, but then there's another one, which is right here. That screw's got to come out too. So if you have a scope on this rifle, or if you have even a scope base that comes out here like the Redfield does, you can't get straight down on that screw slot with that base on there. So it can be, pulling the gun out of the stock is not something that should be done routinely on this gun, and you end up having to pull the scope to do it. So I wouldn't suggest doing it unless you have to. So we're going to break for just a second. I'm going to pull this out of the stock because there's some interesting things in here that are unique to the XP100. Give me 1 second. Okay, so we've separated the barreled action from the stock. So we have the front action screw and then the rear action screw. I always like to keep, if I use different screwdriver bits, I like to keep the screwdriver bits that way, with the screws, that way I don't get them messed up. It's super important to make sure your screwdriver bits fit your screw slots when you're working on a gun. There's nothing that looks more bubblified than a screwed up slot on a screw. So anyway, this is the underside of the XP100. So you can see this long trigger link right here. You have your trigger, the trigger housing, and then you have all the sear assembly back here in the safety. And if you notice on this safety, and we talked about it in the 700 video, this particular gun will operate, or you can unload the chamber with the safety on. This is the safety on position. So after 1975, I think it was, Remington trimmed this arm back to where it doesn't lock the bolt when it's rotated up into the safe position. So, and that's the same modification that we talked about doing with the Remington 700 triggers. So if you notice this screw right here, that screw right here is kind of the take-up screw, if you will. And you notice that this is how it came in 1980. So you could, with acetone or something along that line, get rid of that red lacquer / thread locker and adjust that in to where it's going to eliminate some of the take-up on this trigger. Now you can, if you go too far, then it's not going to have adequate sear engagement. When you close the bolt, it's going to drop the striker. So be very careful. I don't, and my official recommendation is leave it alone. Don't do it, but I know you're going to do it anyway, probably. But just be very cautious with that. The other thing that we used to do in the past is some of these pins here, this pin, and some of these pins that go across here through the sear assembly, can be a little undersized, and we would actually machine exact tolerance pins to reduce side-to-side slack on those parts to help with the trigger. But this gun here, I mean, out of the box, as set up, is tripping at 2 pounds on my electronic lineman scale, with a little bit of creep, but it's repeatable creep, so I guess you can learn to stage it fairly well. So this is kind of how the inside of this gun looks, and how to take it out of the action. So, or how to take the action out of the stock. So there's really no need. Some people, bench rest shooters, and the guys they're not hunting with the gun, not taking the gun to the field, actually delete the safety out of it. It's not a hard thing to do to delete the safety. We don't recommend ever deleting any safety at all, especially if you're going to take the gun hunting. So the safety is held in place by this horseshoe-shaped clip here. So if we look at the inside of the stock, we have some interesting things going on here. We have several holes drilled right here in the barrel channel. And what a lot of people would do would be to fill those with lead weights. A lot of people took 38 caliber lead bullets and just plugged those holes with those lead bullets, and then, sanded them down to where, you know, the barrel would still free float over them, to reduce muzzle flip for recoil, particularly in things other than 221 Fireball. 7BR's got a little bit of recoil to it. Certainly 35 Remington does, and then some of the other calibers that this gun was produced in. But I want to direct your attention to this piece, this little guy right here. This is a little spring-loaded device that's just stuck in there. There's it's called the trigger balance. So you have the trigger balance, the pin, and the spring that lives in there, and it's just, you could just pull it straight out if you wanted to. And that comes up through this hole in the trigger link. And what it's balancing is the inertia of the trigger assembly, the trigger link, and it functions as a drop safety. So if you were to drop the gun or bump the gun hard or things of that nature, this provides additional resistance to keep the gun from having an accidental discharge due to the inertia of the parts actually causing the sear to trip. So it's a pretty ingenious idea. Now, a lot, again, of IHMSA shooters and a lot of strictly target shooters removed that, just pulled it out of the stock, set it aside, put the gun back together, and they claim it helped with trigger pull. And maybe it did, I don't know. Again, our official, if any lawyers are listening, we don't recommend deleting any type of safety whatsoever, including that one. So putting this gun back together can be a bit wonky because this guy right here moves. It's not set sturdily into the stock. It's designed to kind of wiggle a little bit. So when you go to put this gun back together, you have to reach in from the top, line this hole up, and then run your screw in and tighten it in. And this guy right here also, he moves a little bit. So it helps when you put it back together if you just insert that long stock bolt screw and allow the head of the screw in its recess here in the nylon stock to kind of hold that a little bit more steady when you put it back together. So sometimes it's a little difficult to get all that, and if you still have this trigger balance in there, you've got to line all this stuff up. The front action screw goes through this recess in the trigger bar or the trigger link. The trigger balance goes through this one, and then the other action screw goes into this. Whoops. That little washer, that's a little retainer washer right there that's sticking out. So you have to get all that roped into alignment in order for the screws to go in straight. And that's the other potential problem, is when you put the bolt action, or when you put the action back in the stock, it can pivot like that, and what you're doing is you're actually not lined up on the trigger balance, and the action is pivoting right here. So getting all that lined up just perfectly back together to where the screws are running straight can cause a little bit of frustration. And maybe some not so nice words, and occasionally a screwdriver gets flung across the shop. But we try to minimize that if at all possible. And that brings us back to this screw right here. So this rear action screw, this guy that sticks down through this hole, there's that little washer. We'll put him back on. But he goes right through that hole right there. So it's real easy to have that at an angle, especially with that moving. So when I put these guns back together, I visually line the screw up with this stud right here. And if you have a scope base on there, particularly a scope base that sticks forward of this rear receiver ring, almost always you will be trying to start that screw at an angle. And you can strip that screw out fairly easily. And then you have to either make a new screw or rethread the screw or run it through a tap or something. But so a little bit of caution there. It's a little bit more finicky than, say, a Remington 700 or even Remington 600 or Model 7. So, but it can be done. There's just as long as you pay attention to that kind of stuff. So the Remington XP100, they're out there. They made quite a few. I mean, really, what, 31 years of production on this model. So there are some that are more collectible than others, and some that bring higher prices than others. So the original ones, the 10.5-inch fireballs with a vent barrel, if they're unmodified, they're bringing some money. So again, we look at the three different things. We look at condition, we look at scarcity, and we look at originality to determine kind of what the value is on these guns. So any of the aftermarket modifications, particularly if maybe the stock has been carved on or a stock has been added that is not necessarily the best job, that's going to negatively affect the value. So the originality, this gun here is all original, so that's good. The Silhouette version in 7BR, it was made from what, 80 to 94, so 14 years. So there's quite a few of those out there, and 7BR was the primary chambering in that. This gun in 35 Remington would bring more. So realistically, an unmodified original XP100 is going to be just south of $1,000. Ones that have been cut up or chopped up or not treated well, the value drops off quickly. So bear that in mind if you're looking at the XP100. So any custom stuff that's done to it, it all depends on the quality and who did the custom stuff. So there were a couple of guys that made triggers for these that were really, really good, and then some guys hacked up the triggers and it was really, really bad. So that can affect it as well. So XP100s, if you like handgun hunting, if you like single shot pistols in decent size calibers, pick one up if you can get a hold of one. They're nice little guns. The reason they went away is Thompson Center. The Contender came out a few years after this gun, and the Contender couldn't really touch it as far as the chamberings go, as far as the variety of chamberings or the ability to chamber certain cartridges. But when Thompson Center brought out the Encore, it certainly was able to take care of any caliber that the XP100 was in. So, and the Sport of IH MSA kind of faded. It didn't fade away. People still shoot it, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be. So, in any event, a collectible gun from Remington. This one's from 1980, 1963 to 94 is when it was made. So, XP100. Grab one up if you can find it. If you like what we're doing, please be sure to let us know. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We try to post content on interesting stuff as we get a hold of it. So far, we've been fairly fortunate in that regard. If you have any ideas or any requests about a specific model you want us to take a look at, we'll certainly try to accommodate it if we can. Drop us a line, drop us a comment, or send us an email, and we'll be happy to do that for you. And as always, we appreciate you watching. Thanks for your time.